Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the online platform. We are gathered here today for the second day of the online lecture series, which was initiated on the 13th of July 2023 to commemorate the Foundation Day of the Physiological Society of India. This online lecture series was organized and initiated by the Education Committee of the Physiological Society of India, targeting to cater to the needs in the curricular aspect of physiology courses at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Today is the second installment in the series, and the theme has been set right at the heart. On this occasion, I would like to request the Honorary General Secretary of the Physiological Society of India, Dr. Rajan Haldar, Assistant Professor, Department of Physiology, University of Calcutta, to kindly present the welcome address. Over to Sir.
Thank you, Darshani. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all the members of the Education Committee of the Physiological Society of India. Your arduous effort make it possible to initiate this lecture series for the physiology students, both basic and applied. On 13 July 2023, on the day of PSI Foundation celebration, we have arranged two lectures targeting our physiology students, and we promise to continue this as a lecture series in monthly basis and if possible bi-monthly. Our efficient education committee has made it possible to keep our promise. At present, we arrange monthly basis lecture series. In future, it will be bi-monthly. Moreover, my dear students, there are many things coming for you that will be very surprising for you also. Now, I convey my sincere gratitude to Professor Amar K. Chandra, Honorable President of the Physiological Society of India, for his kind presence in the lecture series. Despite his busy schedule, he has managed to attend this event. Today, we have with us Dr. Asim Basak, Professor of the Department of Allied Health Sciences, Brainware University, Kolkata, and Dr. Vinay Chitturi, Assistant Professor of the Department of Physiology, All in Institute of Medical Sciences, Rajkot. They will be sharing their valuable knowledge on cardiac cycle and electrocardiography. I sincerely thank both of them for their presence as a resource person for today's lecture series. With warm wishes to all my dear students, I conclude here. Thank you very much. It's over to Dakshani.
Thank you, Sir. I now request the President of the Physiological Society of India, Professor Amar Kumar Chandra, Professor Emeritus UGC, Department of Physiology, University of Calcutta, to kindly deliver the presidential address. Over to Sir. Professor Chandra, I think there is a glitch in the line, so we would be waiting for a couple of minutes for Professor Chandra. However, in the meantime, before we can have Professor Chandru with us for the presidential lecture, I would like to give a brief description about today's lecture. Today, both of the lectures are dedicated to our heart. So we will begin at our heart, and one will be on cardiac cycle, which will be given by our honorable speaker, Professor Asim Kumar Basak. And the next will be on electrocardiography, which will be given by Dr. Vinay Chitturi. I think there is a connectivity problem with Professor Chandro. He is unavailable at the moment. I would like to request our Vice President, Professor Proshun Priyo Nayok, to kindly say a few words. Professor Nayok? Professor Nayok? I'm extremely sorry. I guess there are problems due to rain or thunder shower in some of the areas. So probably both the presidents and vice presidents are unavailable. In that situation, I would like to proceed with our lecture series because I know all our audience are eagerly waiting for the same. So, starting at heart for our first lecture, we on cardiac cycle, we have with us Professor Asim Kumar Basak. He is presently working as professor in the Department of Allied Health Sciences in Brainware University, Barashat, Kolkata. Dr. Boshak has vast experience in teaching physiology for MBBS, BDS, and MDS courses, as well as different paramedical courses for the last 27 years. He authored a number of textbooks and guidebooks in physiology for MBBS, BDS, and also different allied health sciences courses, which are published by reputed national and international publishers. He has published more than 20 research articles in different national and international journals of repute and also serves as an honorary reviewer and editorial committee member of different national and international journals. Professor Boshak is also a life member of the Physiological Society of India and Indian Science Congress Association and awarded different national awards including Bibi Sarkar Memorial Award and Shubha Mukherjee Memorial Award. Thank you. Professor Boshak will be speaking on the cardiac cycle. Over to our honorable speaker, Professor Boshak.
Good, good evening, everybody.
সবাই স্ক্রিনে রয়েছে
Myself, Dr. Asim Kumar Basak, will like to present the topic cardiac cycle. In this relation, I want to express my sincere thanks to Education Committee of the PSI for giving me the opportunity to present these topics on this platform. In this relation, I want to mention that this is most probably is the first kind of innovative approach on behalf of any society in the medical field, which has taken this initiative to for the benefit of the students. Anyway, Today I'll talk about the cardiac cycle. So here you can see the MRI video on a heart of a baby, of a baby's heartbeat. So here you see that heart is beating, and this beating of the heart first appears in the fetal life in around 6 weeks of the gestation, and it uh, continues till the death of the person. That means for the lifelong, even from the fetal life, 6 weeks of the gestation, the heartbeat starts. And if the heart fails, that means there is a death. Now, the heart failure, this is basically because of two gross reasons. One is the failure of the blood, failure of the heart to fill the blood, that is the diastolic abnormality, or failure of the heart to eject out the blood, that is the systolic abnormality. That means the any type of cardiac abnormality is basically because of the abnormality of the cardiac cycle. So let us see first what is cardiac cycle, what are the different changes takes place in cardiac cycle, along with some clinical implications of the cardiac cycle. So first, regarding the cardiac cycle, what is cardiac cycle? Cardiac cycle is basically the events that takes place in each and every heartbeat. It is the event, different type of event that takes place from beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next heartbeat, or in each heartbeat, what are the events, what are the incidents are taking place in the heart that are collectively known as the cardiac cycle. Now the normal cardiac cycle duration is equal to 60 per heart rate. The 60 is the minute, 60 seconds, and heart rate. So if the heart rate is 75, it arounds the normal cardiac cycle, it will be around 0.8 second. And this is inversely related with the heart rate. That means cardiac cycle, if the heart rate is more, cardiac cycle duration will be less. If the heart rate is less, cardiac cycle duration will be more. So heart rate, cardiac cycle duration is inversely related with the heart rate. More heart rate, less cardiac cycle duration, less heart rate, more cardiac cycle duration. Now, as per the phases of the cardiac cycle, it is grossly divided into two sub-cycles. One is the atrial cycle and second one is the ventricular cycle. So in this circle you can see, the inner one represents the atrial cycle, which is divided into again zero. As I told that normal duration is 0.8 seconds. So if we divide the cycle into 8 division, then we'll get that atrial cycle is divided into two subphases. One is the atrial diastole, during which atria relaxes, atrial muscle relaxes, so that atria gets filled with the blood. And that duration is the prolonged duration, which is around 0.7 seconds. And remaining part, very short part of the atrial cycle, in which atria contracts, so that whatever blood is filled within the atria, that ultimately is transferred to the ventricle, so that ventricle is filled with the entire amount of the blood. So atrial cycle has got two subphase. One is the atrial diastole, and that is 0.7 second, and another one is the atrial systole, which is around 0.1 second. The outer circle here resembles the ventricular cycle. This outer one resembles the ventricular cycle. So ventricular cycle is again of is again comprised of two subphases. One is known as the ventricular diastole and second one is known as the ventricular systole. So during the ventricular diastole, the ventricular muscle relaxes. So ventricle is filled with the blood and that duration is around 0.5 seconds. Whereas the latter phase is known as the ventricular systole, in which the contractions of the ventricular muscle takes place, because of which blood is ejected out of the ventricle, the duration of which is around 0.3 seconds. That means ventricular cycle is again divided into two subphases. One is the ventricular diastole having 0.5 second duration and second one is the ventricular systole having 0.3 second duration. Now during the ventricular diastole, as I told, during the ventricular diastole, blood is filled within the ventricle. Now this filling of the blood that takes place in the diastole, that takes place into three subphases again. First one is the first rapid filling phase. So initially there is a very rapid filling of the blood from the atria to the ventricle. That is known as the first rapid filling phase. Second one is the slow filling phase. And third one is the last rapid filling phase that is actually coincides with the atrial systole. So last rapid filling phase is due to the rapid rush of the blood from the atria to the ventricle because of the atrial systole or contractions of the atrial muscle. So all of these things I will discuss in details later on. On the other hand, in the ventricular systole, as I told that ventricular muscle contracts, and because of the force of the contraction, the blood is ejected out of the ventricle. Blood is ejected out of the ventricle, and that is known as the ejection phase. And this ejection of the blood out of the ventricle takes place in two phases. First one is again very rapid one, which is known as the rapid ejection, and second one is rather slower rate, which is known as the slow ejection. So ventricular systole is again comprised of two subphases, rapid ejection and the slow ejection. Now the important part of this cardiac cycle is the different events associated with this cardiac cycle. So what are the events that takes place in the cardiac cycle? And each of these events has got different type of clinical significance. So there are four major events takes place in the cardiac cycle. First one here you can see is the pressure changes. So pressure changes. So pressure changes takes place in the atria or pressure changes during the atrial cycle. Pressure changes in the ventricular cycle. Pressure changes in the ventricular cycle. Pressure changes in the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So that I will discuss one by one. Second event takes place is the volume changes. Basically, because of the systole and diastole of the heart, because of the contractions of the cardiac musculature, volume changes takes place, and as the pressure and the volume has got inverse relationship, there is a changes of the pressure. So basically volume changes takes place because of the contraction and the relaxations of the cardiac musculature. As a result, pressure changes takes place. So pressure changes is the first event, second event is the volume changes, and third one is the productions of the heart sound. Associated with these pressure changes, the valves of the heart, they gets closed or opens. Now closure of the heart valve are always the sudden process that creates the vibration which produces the heart sound. So cardiac cycle is also associated with the productions of the heart sound. And fourth event is the electrical events, in which the electrical action potential which are transmitted throughout the cardiac musculature, that can be recorded by help of the ECG machine and that is the events which are known as the electrical events. So today my discussion is basically on these three events: pressure changes, volume changes, productions of the heart sound, electrical events or the electrical changes of the heart, that will be discussed by some other distinguished faculty member. So let us see first what's happened in case of atrial cycle, what pressure changes takes place in case of atrial cycle. So before starting my discussion, here you see this is the condition of the heart just beginning of the or before the atrial events. So before the atrial events, here you see the semilunar valves are closed and atrioventricular valves are opened. And as the atrioventricular valves are opened, blood can come in from the atria to the ventricle. Now, in this particular phase, what's happened? Here you see, in this particular phase, this is the condition I told. Semilunar valves are closed and AV valves are opened. Now, this is the condition in which the atrial muscle relaxes. As the atrial muscle relaxes, the from the upper part of the body through the superior vena cava and from the lower part of the body through the inferior vena cava, blood enters into the atria. Blood enters into the atria. And as the semilunar valves are opened, opened, whatever blood enters into the atria, they are directly transferred into the ventricles. Thereby, during the atrial diastole, there is a passive ventricular filling. During the atrial diastole, there is a passive ventricular filling. So whatever blood enters into atria, that directly enters into the ventricle as the AV valves are opened. And generally, around 70 to 80% of the blood that is coming to the atria during atrial diastole that enters into the ventricle. Now, in the atrial diastole is followed by atrial systole. Here, what's happened? Here you see the atrial muscle now contracts. As the atrial muscle contracts, there is a changes of the volume takes place. Volume is reduced. As the volume is reduced, pressure is again increased, and because of the high pressure developed within the atria, blood is rushed to the ventricle. Blood is rushed to the ventricle, and thereby during the atrial systole, there is a ventricular filling which is active one. So during the atrial diastole, blood is filled within the ventricle. 70 to 80% of the blood is filled in the ventricles by the passive process, whereas in case of atrial systole, as the atria contracts, there is a maximum pressure generated within the atria, and because of the pressure gradient, the blood is rushed from atria to the ventricles very rapidly, and that is why there is a active ventricular filling that takes place around remaining 20 to 30% of the blood. So this is about the events during atrial cycle. Now, so this whatever things I have discussed, that is the summary of these things during atrial diastole, what's happened, during atrial systole, what's happened. Now these changes of the pressure within the atria, as I told, that during atrial diastole, the pressure is getting developed within the atria. Again, during atrial systole, pressure is again developed within the atria. Now, these atrial pressure changes can be recorded from external jugular vein, and that record is known as the jugular venous pulse, which has got immense clinical importance. So here you see, this is the graphical view record of the jugular venous pulse, which has got three positive waves. One is known as the A wave, C wave, and the V wave. A wave, C wave, and the V wave. These are the three positive waves, and two negative waves, X descends and the Y descends. So in the jugular venar pulsation, we can get this type of waveform. So here A is basically, A means here you see that atrial pressure is getting more, is getting increased, and this is because of the atrial systole. So during atrial systole, as the atria contracts, the volume is getting decreased. So pressure is becoming high, and thereby curve is going upward. That will denote the A curve. Now, the downward deflections of the A, this is because of the atrial diastole. Now, the second positive wave is the C. So C is basically because of the isovolumic contractions period of the ventricular systole. So that I have not discussed here, ventricular events. So what's happened during ventricular initial period of the ventricular systole? What's happened? The enough pressure is developed within the ventricle, and that because of that pressure, first the AV valve gets closed, and as the AV valve gets closed, this will be discussed again under the ventricular events. So at that time with the diagram I can show you. So at this moment I can, you just remember that during the ventricular early phase of the ventricular systole, AV valve first closes. After that, there is a maximum pressure developed within the ventricle, and that pressure used to or that pressure leads the inward bulging of the tricuspid valve towards the atria. That means the AV valve goes towards the atria and minimizing the atrial volume. As the atrial volume is getting decreased again, pressure will be raised, and that will give you the second positive wave, that is known as the C wave. And third positive wave is the V wave. This is basically because of the venous return. As during atrial diastole, blood is filled within the atria. During the atrial diastole, as the blood is getting filled within the atria, the pressure within the atria will be increased, and that will give you the third positive wave, that is the V wave. Now regarding the negative waves X and Y. X negative wave, this is basically because of the going back of the tricuspid valve towards its original position. That means inward bulging will not be retained, tricuspid valve will descend down, and thereby volume of the atria will be more, so pressure will be less, and that will give the X negative descents. And Y negative one, that is basically because of the passing of the blood from atria to the ventricle, slow passing of the blood collected within the atria towards the ventricle as the AV valve remains open. So these are the physiological reason behind the appearance of the A, C, V positive waves, and X and Y are the negative waves. Now this tubular venous pulsations has got very, very important clinical importance. For example, if the A wave in this JVP form is absent or wavy, that denotes it is the case of atrial fibrillation. There is a fibrillation within the atrial muscle. Similarly, large A wave, if the A wave is very prominent, very large, that means it is the case of pulmonary stenosis or the pulmonary hypertension. Similarly, very large A wave, that is known as cannon A wave, that denotes the complete heart block. On the other hand, large V wave, if the V wave is very high, very prominent, and very waveform is very high, large, then that denotes that tricuspid regurgitation. On the other hand, this jugular venous pulsation, Generally, this is similar in case of inspiration and the expiration, but in certain extent, certain conditions, the rise of the JVP is very high during inspiration, and this is the condition which takes place in case of constrictive pericarditis, and that is the sign which is known as the Kussmaul sign. So these are the clinical importance of the jugular venous pulse waveform. Now is about the ventricular events. So atrial events is over. Now is about the ventricular events. So ventricular events, as I told, is comprised of two cycle, two subcycle. One is the ventricular diastole, another is the ventricular systole. So before ventricular diastole, obviously there was the ventricular systole. So at this is the condition, this is the diagram which depicts the end of the ventricular ejection. At the during the ventricular ejection, you all know that the blood is ejected out of the ventricle because of the contractions of the ventricular muscle, because of the systole of the heart, and blood is ejected out as the semilunar valves are opened. So here you see semilunar valves are opened, so blood goes out, and this pumping out of the heart takes place because of the active contractions of the ventricular muscle in which the AV valves closed. So this is the end position of the ventricular ejection. Semilunar valves are opened and AV valves are closed. Now what's happened? This is the conditions as I told earlier. Now what's happened? During the ventricular diastole fast, there is a, in the second diagram you can see here, there is a period of isovolumic relaxations or isometric type of relaxations of the ventricular muscle takes place. So in the early part of the ventricular diastole, what's happened? The ventricular muscle undergoes isometric type of relaxation in which muscle length remains same, tension is decreased. As the tension is decreased, first what's happened? As the tension is decreased, first what's happened? The semilunar valves will be closed, so that because of the fall of the pressure within the ventricles, no blood from the aorta or the pulmonary artery return back to the ventricle. So to prevent the returning back of the ejected blood into the aorta or in the pulmonary artery, there should be the closure of the semilunar valve. So semilunar valves get closed here. Semilunar valves get closed here. And see, at the initial period, semilunar valves get closed. Now, this semilunar valve closure is associated with the productions of the sound, that is the second heart sound. So during the closure of the semilunar valve, the second heart sound is produced. Now what's happened? In the next phase, what's happened? Here you see. Here you see. The ventricle undergoes the further diastole in which the length is increased. So it is no longer the isometric or isovolumic type of relaxations. So here the length is getting increased because of the relaxations of the ventricular muscle. So volume is getting more and pressure is getting low. As the pressure is low and as the atria has collected a large amount of the blood from the body, atria is filled with the blood, atrial pressure is more. Because of the pressure gradient, there is a rapid entry of the blood. There is a rapid entry of the blood from the atria to the ventricle as the AV valves open. So first, semilunar valve closed to prevent the backflow of the blood, and then there is a opening of the AV valves, because of which there is a entry of the blood from the atria to the ventricle. So And this entry of the blood in initially is very rapid in rate, and that this is known as the first rapid filling phase. Now after certain period, what's happened? The gradient in between the atria and the ventricle will be decreased. Why? This is because certain amount of the blood is already transferred to the ventricle. So atria is now little bit emptied and ventricle is little bit filled. So the pressure difference between atria and the ventricle will be reduced. As the pressure difference is getting reduced, what's happened? The flow rate, the entry rate of the blood from the atria to the ventricle will become slower, and that is known as the slow filling phase. So first one is the very rapid filling, then is the slow filling. Now what's happened? In the meantime, the atria will undergo the systole. Here you see the atria will undergo the systole. Now as the atria will undergo the systole, atrial volume will be again reduced, so pressure will be again increased, and as the atrial pressure is again increased, the pressure gradient, pressure difference between the atria and the ventricle is again high, will be again high. And because of this high pressure gradient between the atria and the ventricle, there is again rapid filling of the blood or transfer of the blood from atria to the ventricle, which is known as the last rapid filling phase. So during ventricular diastole, first there will be the closure of the seminal valves, then there will be the opening of the AV valves, because of which initially there is a rapid filling of the blood from atria to the ventricle, then slow filling of the blood to the ventricle, and finally the again rapid filling of the blood by the ventricle, which is known as the last rapid filling phase. Now, during the closure of the seminal valves, as I told, the second heart sound will be heard. Third heart sound will be heard during the first rapid filling phase. First rapid filling phase will be associated with the third heart sound, which will be soft in nature. It is not normally audible except in case of adult, only in case of child and very lean and thin persons, adult person, only these third heart sounds are seen. Otherwise, it is heard. Otherwise, it is not audible. Whereas the fourth heart sound is heard during the atrial systole, in which there is a rapid filling of the blood from the atria to the ventricle. That means last rapid filling phase is associated with another sound, which is known as the fourth heart sound, which is very soft in nature. So during ventricular diastole, three heart sounds are produced: second heart sound, third heart sound, and fourth heart sound. So this is about the events during the ventricular diastole. Now regarding the ventricular systole. So this is the diagram which I have left over in the last slide. That is the end position of the ventricular diastole. End position of the ventricular diastole. Now what's happened? There is a contractions of the ventricular muscle starts. Here you see contractions of the ventricular muscle starts. Initially, there is a isometric type of contraction known as period of isovolumic contractions. Now, during this period of isovolumic contraction, first what's happened? The AV valves closed. Previously, AV valves were opened. Now, what's happened? The AV valves will close. And what for it is getting closed? Because as the ventricle is contracting, as the pressure is generating within the ventricle, blood may return back to that atria. So to prevent the returning of the blood to the atria, the door should be closed. Door between the atria and the ventricle should be closed. And this is why AV valves is getting close. Now this isovolumic contraction period is further continued so that there is a sufficient pressure, sufficient rise of the pressure takes place in within the ventricular chamber. And once the pressure will be high enough, then what's happened? The semilunar valves will now open. Here you see, now the semilunar valves are open. Here you see, the semilunar valves are open. As the semilunar valves are opened, blood from the ventricles will be rushed to outside to the aorta to the pulmonary artery. Initially is in very rapid rate, which is known as the rapid ejection phase. Rapid ejection phase. So first part of the ventricular systole that results the very rapid rate of the ejection of the blood out of the ventricle, which is known as the once certain amount of the blood is already sent back to the aorta or to the pulmonary artery, then because of the pressure gradient is decreased, the exit of the blood, expulsion of the blood out of the ventricle will become slower, and that is known as the slow ejection phase. So during the ventricular systole, there is a first rapid ejection takes place, and then there is a slow ejection takes place. But before that, one thing I didn't mention here, that is the in the earlier cycle ventricular diastole, I told you that there are three heart sounds are produced: second, third, and fourth. Now regarding the first heart sound. Now first heart sound is getting produced in the initial part of the ventricular systole when there is a closure of the AV valve takes place. So closure of the AV valve is again the rapid process, sudden process, which creates the vibration, and that is to create a very sharp sound that is known as the first heart sound. So, that is known as the first heart sound. So first heart sound takes place during ventricular systole. Second, third, and fourth heart sound takes place during ventricular diastole. So this is all about the different pressure, volume changes, and the productions of the heart sound associated with the ventricular cycle. Now this is the summary. So as I told that during the ventricular diastole, initially there is a isometric relaxations of the ventricular muscle that results the decrease in intraventricular tension, and thereby backflow of the blood from aorta and the pulmonary artery towards ventricle, which is prevented by the closure of the semilunar valves. And this closure of the semilunar valves will create the sound that is the second heart sound. And this one first, second, and third step, this is known as these three phases are collectively known as the protodiastole. After that, the relaxations of the ventricular muscle goes on, thereby there is a fall of the intraventricular tension, and that results the opening of the atrioventricular valve. So fourth step and the fifth step is collectively known as the isovolumic relaxation period, because during this phase the volume remains same, tension is only decreased. And as the AV valve now opens, there is a rapid transfer of the blood from atria to the ventricle, that is first rapid filling phase. Afterwards, it will become slow due to reduced gradient, that is known as slow filling. And finally, again the rapid inflow of the blood because of the atrial systole, and that is known as the last rapid filling. So first rapid filling produces the third heart sound, and last rapid filling phase produces the fourth heart sound. Now the events during the ventricular systole, that is summary part. So similarly, isometric type of contraction takes place in the ventricular muscle that results the rise of ventricular tension, intraventricular tension, and thereby because of the more tension, more pressure in the ventricle, there is a backflow of the blood from atria towards the ventricle, and that is prevented. Sorry, here it will be the printing mistake here. It will be the backflow of the blood from ventricle towards the atria, and thereby that should be prevented by closure of the AV valves. Closure of the AV valves. And this, once the AV valve gets closed, further contraction of the ventricular muscle takes place to increase the sufficient pressure within the ventricle, and because of that sufficient pressure, semilunar valves open. So from 1 to 5 states are collectively known as the isovolumic contraction period of the ventricular systole, and this ultimately results ejection of the blood out of the ventricles, initially rapidly and then in slower rate. So this is the different values of the pressure changes in different chambers. Here you can see in the right atrium the normal range 2 to 6 millimeter of mercury. In the right ventricle, during systole it is 15 to 25. During diastole it is 2 to 8 mmHg. In the pulmonary artery, systolic 15 to 25, diastolic 8 to 15. Left atrium, it is 6 to 12 mmHg, and left ventricle, that is maximum one, systolic 100 to 140, diastolic 3 to 12. This is the values, peak values of different pressure changes in different phases of the cardiac cycle. And as per the volume is concerned, as I told, that during ventricular diastole, blood is filled within the ventricle. Blood is transferred from the atria to the ventricle. How much blood? At the end position of the diastole, how much blood is getting collected within the ventricle? This is around 110 to 120 ml of the blood. And that amount of the blood collected at the end of diastole, ventricular diastole, is known as the end diastolic volume. Out of this 110 or 120 ml, certain amount of the blood is ejected out, and this is known as the stroke volume. So out of 110 to 120, around 70 ml of the blood is ejected out per beat of the heart, and remaining 40 to 50 ml of the blood remains within the ventricle. They are not ejected out of the heart. So that amount of the blood which remains within the ventricle at the, even at the end of systole, even by the maximum systole, that amount of the blood is not ejected out of the ventricle. So that amount of the blood is always retained by the heart, which is around 40 to 50 ml. And the fraction ejected is then 60%. That means out of 120 ml of the blood, the 70 ml of the blood is ejected out. So that ratio is around 60%. So ejection fraction is very important clinical features for understanding the capability of the heart, functional capability or capacity of the heart. So heart sound, as I already told, so there are 4 heart sounds, and all of the heart sounds are not audible in the stethoscope by the help of the stethoscope, but they can be recorded, and the record of the heart sound is known as the phonocardiogram. So out of these 4 heart sounds, first and the second heart sounds are audible, and third and fourth heart sounds are known as the recorded sound. Those are the recorded sound, and that record is known as the phonocardiogram. So I will. So as first, regarding the first heart sound, I have already mentioned this is longer in duration, softer in pitch than the second heart sound, and this resembles the word love. And this is, as I told earlier, due to the closure of the AV valves at the beginning of the ventricular systole. And this is best heard in the mitral area. What is mitral area? I'll come to this point. So I'll not go details about the second heart sound. Similarly, very short in nature, short in duration, comparatively very sharp, 50 hertz frequency. It represents the word dub, and it is caused by the closure of the seminolar valve at the beginning of the ventricular diastole, and best heard in the pulmonary and the aortic area, that I will come to this point. Third heart sound, as I told, during the first rapid filling phase, normally not audible, very soft and short, and due to fast rapid filling phase of ventricular diastole. Whereas fourth heart sound is the purely recorded sound, and it is due to the last rapid filling phase of ventricular diastole, which I already discussed. Now regarding the auscultative area, as I told, that if you place the stethoscope over the chest surface, you can listen the lub and dub sound. But there are some particular areas on the chest surface. If you place the stethoscope, then that particular sound will be best heard. So accordingly, there are four type of auscultatory areas. These four areas are known as the aortic area, pulmonary area, tricuspid area, and the mitral area. Aortic area, pulmonary area, tricuspid area, and the mitral area. Now, in the tricuspid sound and the mitral sound, these are basically because of the closure of the atrioventricular sound. So the first heart sound will be best heard if you place the stethoscope over the tricuspid area and the mitral area. So if the place the stethoscope at the tricuspid area, then the tricuspid sounds will be best heard. And if you place the stethoscope over the mitral area, then the mitral valve sound will be best heard. Similarly, if you place the stethoscope at the aortic area, aortic component of the second heart sound, seminoral valve closure, will be best heart sound, will best heard. And if you place the stethoscope over the pulmonary area, the pulmonary component of the second heart sound, due to the closure of the seminoral valve, will be best heard. So aortic and pulmonary area is designated for listening the second heart sound properly, and mitral and the tricuspid area is designated for the uh, first heart sound, listening of the first heart sound. Now, this aortic and this area can be demarcated from a anatomical structure that is known as the sternal angle or angle of Lewis. So here you see this is the manubrium. This is the manubrium of the this is the manubrium, and this is the sternum, and this is a joint that is known as the manubriosternal joint or sternomanubrial joint. So at the sternomanubrial joint, the second intercostal rib articulates. At the sternomanubrial joint, that is known as the sternal angle, the second thoracic rib articulates or joints. And below that, there is a second intercostal space. So right side, right sternal border, second intercostal space, that is the area known as the aortic area. Left side, second intercostal space, left sternal border, second intercostal space, that is the area designated for pulmonary area. Now at the fifth intercostal space, just left sternal margin, that is the area which is known as the tricuspid area. And the left mid clavicular line, here you see this is the mid clavicular line. At the mid clavicular line, this is the mid clavicular line. At the mid clavicular line, which coincides with the fifth intercostal space, that is the area which is designated for mitral area. So these are the four auscultatory areas in which different components of the heart sounds are best heard, and thereby these are known as the auscultatory areas. So this I will not. This is about the aortic area, as I told earlier. Pulmonary area, as I have already discussed. Bicuspid area, already discussed. and tricuspid area. So all these locations I have already discussed. So now is regarding the pressure changes in the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So as the blood is ejected out of the ventricles within the aorta or in the and in the pulmonary artery, the pressure changes takes place within the aorta and also in the pulmonary artery. And that pressure changes in the aorta can be palpated, can be recorded from any of the peripheral artery like the radial artery. So if you place the any proper electrode on the radial artery or the brachial artery or the femoral artery, then this type of waveform, a record can be obtained, and this one is known as the arterial pulse tracing. So this is the curve which is known as the arterial pulse tracing. And this arterial pulse tracing, here you see three curves are there, three positive curves are there: P wave, that is percussion wave; T wave or tidal wave; and D wave or dichotic wave. P wave, T wave, and the D wave or dichotic wave. And besides this P, T, and D, there is another notch. There is a curve which is known as the C curve, or this is also known as the N, that is known as the dichotic notch, from where the dichotic wave appears. So how this P, T, and D wave takes place? P wave, the percussion wave, this is basically because of the ejection of the blood due to systole of the heart. At the heart undergoes systole, blood ejected out of the aorta. So aorta pressure is getting high, and that will give you the positive pressure, positive curve, that is known as the percussion wave. Now what's happened? The T wave, this is basically because of the elastic recoil of the wall of the aorta. Because of the elastic nature of the wall of the aorta, once the pressure will be, with the high pressure, blood will be ejected out. Initially what's happened? The aorta wall will get expanded, and due to elastic recoil, it will again go back to its it will try to go back to its original position, but it will not go back to its zero level or the origin point, because blood is continuously going out. So there is a positivity of the curve will be maintained at up to a certain extent, and that will give you the T wave. And finally, D wave is basically, dichotic wave is basically because of the filling of the, once the blood is ejected out, systole is over, then blood will be ultimately, the seminal valves are closed. As the seminal valve is be closed, what's happened? A notch will be appeared. A notch will be appeared, and that notch is known as the dichotic notch. That notch is known as the dichotic notch, and or C. Here it is written as C. And as the seminal valves will close, no blood can return back to the ventricle. So within the aorta, certain amount of the blood will be accumulated, and thereby aorta, within the aorta, again the pressure will be increased, and that is why again the curve will go up, that is known as the D wave. And once that amount of the blood will slowly pass to the periphery, the curve will go down. So this is how the dichotic wave will be, uh, PTD wave will be appeared, that can be recorded, and that is also very important for understanding the different type of cardiovascular abnormalities. So same type of pressure changes takes place within the pulmonary artery, but here the magnitude of the pressure developed, that is around 1/5 of the pressure that is developed within the aorta. So same type of pressure changes takes place in the pulmonary artery, but in lesser magnitude. So this is all about the cardiac cycle, and this is the summary of the mechanical events of the cardiac cycle. Here you can see, this is the atrial cycle, This pink curve is they denote the atrial cycle. This one is for the ventricular cycle, and this green one is for the pressure changes in the aorta, and upper one there is a first there is a phonocardiogram or recording of the heart sound, and upper one there is a ECG that will be discussed in greater details.
Thank you, Professor Boshak, for a lucid explanation of the cardiac cycle. Professor Boshak is presently unavailable for the question answer round. He will be available after the completion of the second lecture, so I request all of you to kindly wait till then. Because we missed out on the presidential address, and we presently have with us the Honorable President of the Physiological Society of India, Professor Amar Kumar Chandra, Professor Emeritus UGC, Department of Physiology, University of Calcutta. I kindly request him to deliver the presidential address. Over to sir.
Thank you, Doctor. I am audible.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
I am extremely sorry that I am not able to join in time because some online failure or rather my inability in this regard. So I apologize for the same. First of all, greetings to all the members of the PSI Education Committee as well as the member. For example, Professor Prasun Priya Nayak, Dr. Rajan Haldar, Dr. Dakshayani Mahapatro, and all who are associated to initiate, to implement, and successfully organizing this special official PSI webinar series. Greetings to all those, particularly the students, the researchers, and the faculties who have participated in this webinar series to give it live. My special thanks to Professor Asim Basak uh, and Dr. Vinay Chitturi for their active participation as speaker to deliver the very interesting lecture on cardiovascular physiology, one on cardiac cycle and other on ECG. In this context, it is mentioned that the Executive Committee of PSI has started this approach, particularly the online webinar series a few days back on the very occasion of the Foundation Day celebration of the society, where there were two eminent speakers who have delivered their lectures, one on space physiology and the other on EEG. These are very interesting. All the contents of the lecture are still in my mind. In this occasion, I also, in my presidential address, talked on the Physiological Societies of India, that is, its foundation, its founder member, its present official location, as well as its activities um, during the period. In consistence with it, it is to mention that our society, the Physiological Society of India, started its functioning in official manner since in July 1934. It is a registered society under the Act 21 of 1860. Its official address is in the Department of Physiology, University of Calcutta, Kolkata, West Bengal. It is a non-profit organization with the objective to promote the teaching and to promote the research in physiology in the country and abroad. In my last lecture, I have also given a brief background how the society has been immersed in Kolkata as well as started teaching of physiology in India. Its founder, one of the eminent member, was Professor Asim Basak and others. Professor Basak, an Edinburgh-educated physiologist who, ignoring his prestigious job in UK, came to India in 1900 and started the process of teaching physiology in pre-independent India. If anyone be interested to know the history of physiology, initiation of physiology in India, they may go through the article First 50 Years of Physiology in India, published by Indian History of Science by Indian National Science Academy, where you will get all the things. Again, I am telling the article is First 50 Years of Physiology in India, published by an important journal, Indian History of Science, published by National Science Academy. It is interesting to note that the society used to publish its official journal, Indian Journal of Physiology and Allied Sciences, since 1946. It is a journal of medical and allied sciences just after Indian Journal of Medical Research that published since 1913-1914. Activities of the society. The society's activity is guided by the strict structure of the constitution of the society and by the elected members or executive committee members of the Physiological of India. Its members are throughout the country and abroad. Its major activities are organizing annual conferences in the different parts of the country once in every year. It is a very important event. To publish its official journal is another important activity, that is Indian Journal of Physiology. It is published quarterly, that is 4 times in a year. Since 1946, the authors includes students of physiology and allied sciences, faculties, scientists, and others. The society organizes orations for the eminent scientists to honor them. The society also provides Young Scientist Award for the younger scientists. There are also prizes for the postgraduate students and researchers. Organizing scientific events regularly is also one of the important activities. Foundation Day celebration every year, it is also an important activity and many others. Now, without wasting any more time, I welcome the speakers. In the meantime, Professor Asim Basak has completed his nice lectures on cardiac cycle. It was a nice one. Now I request Dr. Chitturi to deliver his lecture. On behalf of the society, I welcome all those and I hand over the microphone to the convener of the education committee, to my dear Dr. Daksani Mahapatra. Um, so,
Thank you,
we
sir, for your kind words.
thank you very much. I am sorry that I have not participated in time due to my
No, no, sir,
ignorance.
it is okay. We understood. There are some problems in the connectivity very often for all of us, so it is absolutely fine. No problem in that.
Above,
With
above,
that note, sir,
above all, I am ignorant about all these modern aspects.
no, no, sir, that is fine. That is fine with all of us. We all are ignorant of some things or other things, so that is not an issue at all. Thank you
Thank you.
once again, sir. And with this, we move on to our next lecture of this session. We have with us Dr. Vinay Chitturi. Dr. Chitturi is Assistant Professor in the Department of Physiology, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Rajkot. His research interests include quantitative EEG, autonomic function, and digital signal processing. He will be speaking on electrocardiography. Thank you. Over to sir.
Thank you, ma'am. So I'll be presenting about electrocardiography. Right. So, good evening, everyone. So, we already had a presentation on electrocardiography on cardiac cycle, where we discussed primarily the mechanical events of cycle. So, electrocardiography is a way of recording the electrical events which take place in a cardiac cycle. So, as you can see, I have a waveform of ECG scrolling across the screen. So the small one is called a P wave, then we have a QRS complex and T wave. So today we'll primarily be focusing on the genesis of this ECG waves. So what electrical events in the heart lead to the production of this kind of ECG electrocardiography waveform. So, if we see the electrocardiography history, the modern electrocardiograph was based on a technology called the string galvanometer. It was developed by the Dutch physicist Willem Einthoven. So, he got a Nobel Prize in the 1920s for this. So, if you see the old school string galvanometers, they're fairly elaborate affairs. So, subjects used to place their hand and their feet in the hands and feet in the sorry, subjects used to place their hands and feet in buckets of saline water, which would conduct the electric potentials present in this thing. And the idea was they wanted to measure the potential difference between these 2 points using a string galvanometer. So, if there's a potential difference between these two, there'll be a current flowing through these wires, and you can measure the current through a string galvanometer. So if you'll see this thing, it's a fairly elaborate thing, and you would get a live record of how the potential difference between these 2 points is changing over time. So that would be a electrocardiograph. Now your modern electrocardiograph is a much nicer and compacted affair. It's usually operated on a bedside in OPDs, in clinics, or even in teaching laboratories. So you place electrodes at different places on the subject's chest. Maybe sometimes you place electrodes on the limbs too, and you get a paper recording of what's happening here. The recording can be digital too, right? So today I'll primarily focus about the electrical events behind the ECG, what's happening in the heart which is producing the ECG waveforms. So we'll start off with a small part of the presentation on cardiac excitation, how cardiac muscle gets excited, how does the excitation spread throughout the heart in a specific rhythmical matter, and how does this rhythmical pattern of excitation lead to the different ECG waveforms, your P wave, your QRS complex, and T wave. Then finally, we'll discuss a little bit about the 12-lead ECG system, which is commonly used in clinical diagnostics and ECG interpretation. So if you see cardiac muscle, right? So cardiac muscle is a what we call a functional syncytium. So individual cardiac muscle cells, right? Individual cardiac muscle cells like this are connected with each other through gap junctions, and ions can flow from one cell to another cell. Now, cardiac muscle is also an excitable tissue. So, because it's excitable, there's charge separation across its membrane, and this gives rise to a resting membrane potential, right? And when the cardiac muscle is excited somehow, now excitation can come from any source. So, sometimes positive charges from outside the muscle can enter the cell, right? And this can lead to what we call a membrane depolarization. So in pacemaker cells, there's an automatic ionic current which causes this regular slow entry, and eventually the cardiac muscle will fire an action potential. So pacemaker cells have what we call automaticity, right? Sometimes uh, positive charges can also enter from neighboring cells, and this would activate the cardiac muscle. So, if enough positive charges enter a cardiac muscle, then we get what we call depolarization and firing of a action potential. And this action potential will rapidly propagate along the length of the cardiac muscle. So, now you can see there's a reversal of the charge distribution. So you have one muscle which is depolarized, and this neighboring muscle is yet at resting membrane potential. So what we see is a potential difference between these 2 points. So there's negativity here, there's positivity here. So this leads to what we call an instantaneous cardiac dipole. See, negativity, positivity, and there's a cardiac dipole. So now these charges, positive charges, can go through the gap junctions to neighboring cells, right? And if enough of these charges make it through, action potentials are fired in the neighboring cells also, and the action potential propagates along the cardiac muscle. So this is how action potential spreads from one cardiac muscle to another neighboring cardiac muscle cell. So if you see what's happening as action potential is and depolarization is spreading along a series of cardiac muscles. So let's say this muscle got depolarized. So now the current dipole currently is between this cell, the depolarized cell, and the resting cell. So this is the current dipole. So dipoles have a magnitude and the dipoles have a orientation or a direction. So now once the neighboring cell also gets depolarized, now we'll have a new dipole, right? This new dipole will have a different magnitude and a different orientation. So as the current and the action potential keeps spreading, as the depolarizations keep spreading, so we call this a depolarizing front. So as the depolarization keeps spreading, we get new dipoles accordingly. So the idea is, as long as there's some part of the heart which is depolarized and some part of the heart is either depolarized or yet to be polarized, there's basically some part which is excited, some part which is at rest. So there's a current flow between these two, and these current flows lead to the generation of what we call cardiac dipoles. So if you see what's happening in a heart, right? So this is a simplified schematic version, right? To the left you can see some muscles which are depolarized and these are yet to be depolarized. So you will have cardiac dipoles, right? You'll have, sorry, one second, one second. You'll see cardiac dipoles generated. So you'll see a cardiac dipole generated between the depolarized and repolarized part of the heart. Now as the excitation spreads, right? So it's a new part of the heart which is depolarized. The depolarization front has spread. Right now, between these two cells, you see the dipoles, right? The depolarized and the repolarized. So I can take a vector sum of all these dipoles to get the net cardiac dipole for this block of tissue, right? So as the depolarization spreads, we get new net cardiac dipoles every time. So now as depolarization is studying, we can use what we call extracellular field potential recordings. So ECG conceptually is an extracellular recording. So a cardiac electric field is produced because of these cardiac dipoles. So you can place your electrodes at different points in the electric field. So there's a positive electrode here and there's a negative electrode on the left side. So basically what we are doing, we are measuring the potential difference between this point and this point, right? Between the positive electrode minus the negative electrode. So an ECG at its simplest is basically a voltmeter measuring the potential difference between two different points in the cardiac electric field. So right now the entire muscle is at rest. It's at resting membrane potential. So there's no potential difference recorded in this voltmeter. So it's in middle deflection. Now, if one part of the cardiac muscle gets depolarized, right? So the cardiac muscle got depolarized, right? Now there's a cardiac vector pointing in this direction, right? From depolarized tissue to what is yet to be depolarized. So this cardiac dipole will give rise to an electric field. That electric field can be measured by a potential difference between these 2 points. So it's positive under this electrode, it's negative under this electrode. So positive minus negative, you get a positive deflection in your voltmeter. So when your depolarization is traveling along this direction, right, you'll get a positive deflection. Now if the entire muscle is depolarized, so it's negative under this electrode, it's negative under this electrode also, you're back to zero deflection. So the idea is a depolarization traveling along the direction towards a positive electrode would give you a positive deflection. So just to see what's happening. So see what would happen in ECG. So a depolarization traveling towards the positive electrode. So I'll just play this animation again. Right? Depolarization traveling towards the positive electrode created the positive deflection. So the positive deflection is present when there's a difference in voltages between these two electrodes. So this difference in voltage would be there when some part of the field is depolarized and some part is yet to be depolarized. So there's a cardiac dipole between these two parts. Now, what would happen if a depolarization is traveling in the opposite direction, away from the positive electrode, right? You would get a negative deflection, right? So negative deflection. So negative under here, positive under here. We are measuring the difference between this and this. So the negative minus positive, we get a negative deflection because the depolarization is traveling away from the electrode, right? So just to see how a waveform of this in real time would look like, you would get a negative deflection, right? See, the negative deflection represents a time when there's a active cardiac dipole. If there's no active cardiac dipole, you would get a flat line. Right now, sometimes depending on how you place your electrodes, depolarization may travel in a direction perpendicular to the electrodes. Right. So the electrode lead vector is usually drawn from negative electrode to positive electrode. Right. So lead vectors are usually drawn from negative electrode to positive electrode. Now, in these cases, if the cardiac dipoles are being produced in a direction perpendicular to the lead vector, you would get no deflection. So the lead vector is like this, from negative to positive, you would get no deflection. Right? So Dr. Asim already discussed some of the different mechanical events of the heart, about the heart chambers. So primarily the heart has the right side, right atrium, right ventricle, and the left side, left atrium, left ventricle. So now we'll study how cardiac excitation is generated and spread across the different chambers of the heart. Right? So we use ECG to study these things. So in an ECG, we have what we call different limb electrodes. So for example, the Enthoven triangle is a triangle drawn with the heart at the center and the apex pointing downwards. So we are interested in the voltages around on the chest, right? So this is the right side of the chest, left side of the chest, and foot. Now, sometimes for convenience, ECG electrodes, instead of being placed on the Enthoven triangle positions, they are placed on limbs, with the understanding that what's on the right arm. If you place an electrode on the right arm, it would correspond to a chest voltage on the right shoulder. Similarly, an electrode on the left arm would correspond to a voltage on the left shoulder, and electrodes on the left lower limb would left leg would correspond to the foot end of the Enthoven triangle. So voltages at each of these limbs are representative of chest voltage. So if I take a difference between left arm and right arm, it would be equivalent or representative of a potential difference between the left shoulder and right shoulder on the Enthoven triangle. And we also usually place a ground electrode on the right leg. Hmm. So basically in ECG we talk about bipolar limb lead systems, right? So these were the original Enthoven leads which were developed by placing electrodes on the limbs. So lead 1 is defined as the potential difference of left arm minus right arm. So we usually represent leads by means of a lead vector from the negative electrode to the positive electrode. So lead 1 vector is what we call a 0-degree vector. Lead 2 is basically the potential difference between left leg minus right arm. So we represent this by a lead vector in the 60-degree direction from the right arm to the left leg. Lead 3 is the potential difference between the left leg minus left arm. So that is a vector drawn from the left arm to the left leg. It's a 120-degree vector, right? So basically, Enthoven's law, there's a law called Enthoven's law, which says the value of lead 2 at any time is equal to lead 1 plus lead 3. So if you basically add these two values, you can see LA gets cancelled out. So by the mathematical definition of lead 1, 2, and 3, you have a relationship where lead 2 is equal to lead 1 plus lead 3. So if you see the bipolar limb lead vector system, so we spoke about vectors, right? So the lead 1 vector is drawn from negative to positive, lead 2 is negative to positive, lead 3 is negative to positive, right? So if I redraw these vectors as originating from the heart, we get what we call a frontal plane or coronal plane vector system. So lead 1 is at 0 degrees, lead 2 is at 60 degrees, and lead 3 is at 120 degrees. So now at any given time, if there is a cardiac vector, right, like this, because of the electrical activity of the heart, what this leads would measure would be a projection of this vector on the lead vector. So lead 2 has a fairly large projection, whereas lead 1 and lead 3 are basically smaller in size. So as a concept, if the lead vector is very close to the cardiac vector, so the lead records a large potential difference deflection, whereas lead vectors which are in the opposite direction to the cardiac vector, you would get a negative deflection. Lead vectors which are perpendicular, you get zero deflection, or what we call a small equivocal deflection, right? So if you'll see, most of the cardiac activity in the heart tends to be in the direction starting from the right atrium going towards the apex. So it's at roughly around a 60-degree vector. So classically, lead 2 is one of the best representatives of cardiac activity, though this can differ based on inter-individual differences of anatomy, right? So primarily, I'll now go to the rhythmical excitation of the heart as seen in a cardiac cycle, and how does it produce the various changes in ECG. We'll be focusing primarily on the changes classically seen in lead 2, right? So the heart has an electrical conduction system, right? So atria and ventricle are separated by a what we call a fibrous skeleton. So the heart has a pacemaker tissue called sinoatrial node. So the SA node has automaticity. It can automatically generate action potentials in a rhythmic manner. Now these action potentials spread through what we call interatrial pathways to the AV node, atrioventricular node. So these interatrial pathways would cause excitation of the atrial tissue, and finally the cardiac impulse will propagate to the AV node, right? Now AV node gives rise to a conductive bundle, a specialized type of cardiac tissue called the bundle of Hess, right? And the bundle of this has a right branch and a left branch which go to different parts of the ventricle, left and right ventricle correspondingly from the left and right branch. And these branches of the bundle have what we call branches called Purkinje fibers. So these are very fast connecting tissues which ensure that the entire ventricle can depolarize simultaneously and fast in a specific pattern, right? So the importance of this excitation system is this ensures what we call a sequential rhythmic activation. So first the atria activate, then there's some delay here, and then the ventricle activate. So we'll individually go through the rhythmical changes in the cardiac cycle, and then slowly we'll come to the ventricles, right? So the heart has what we call pacemaker system. So SA node is a primary pacemaker, right? It usually produces impulses of cardiac action potential at roughly 60 per minute, and this spreads to the downstream conductor system. Now, in case the SA node is malfunctional for some reason, or there's some altered conduction and this failure of conduction between these two, then the AV node can act as a secondary pacemaker, producing impulses at 40. And if this one also fails, the Purkinje fibers can act as tertiary pacemakers. But in normal cases, the SA node is a primary pacemaker. It overdrives at a faster rate than the AV node and the Purkinje fibers, and basically drives the entire heart. Both atria and ventricle are driven at the same heart rate as the SA node. So let's see how depolarization takes place, right? So depolarization starts from the SA node and spreads across the right atrium, right? So it spreads in a sequential manner. So initially this red area you see I've used to depict depolarized electrically activated myocardium. So the idea is once the myocardium is electrically active, then subsequently there's calcium entry and there'll be contraction. So excitation of the myocardium precedes the contraction. So contraction will follow the excitation, and once the muscle is relaxed, so there'll be repolarization of the muscle. The electrical relaxation, electrical repolarization will precede relaxation of the muscle. So that's the idea. Electrical events precede mechanical events. So the depolarization spreads in a systematic manner across different parts of the heart, right? And eventually the entire atria will be depolarized, right? So how are the cardiac dipoles produced now because of this spread of activity? So initially there's depolarization of the right atrium. So right atrium is depolarized, a small part of it. The rest of the atrium is yet to be depolarized. So we have a cardiac dipoles, right? So if I take the vector sum of all these cardiac dipoles, right, I get a net cardiac dipole at that point of time, right? This net cardiac dipole represents the initial atrial depolarization. Now, as the depolarization spreads, we get newer cardiac dipoles, new net cardiac dipoles, right? Different orientation, different magnitude. So the magnitude of this dipole would depend on the mass of this tissue and the relative mass of this tissue. So greater the mass, greater the magnitude. Direction would depend on the vector sum. So as the depolarization keeps spreading, right, you have new cardiac dipoles being produced, right? So cardiac dipoles like this, cardiac dipoles like this, then more depolarization, new cardiac dipole again, right? Now, if you see the last cardiac dipole, it's smaller, right? Because this much tissue is depolarized, but only a small amount of tissue is yet to be depolarized. So you have a smaller cardiac dipole. So that's the idea. When there's a great mass of tissue which is depolarized and a decent mass of tissue which is yet to be depolarized, you have a greater cardiac dipole. So greater cardiac dipole, you get bigger ECG waves. So let's see how these cardiac vectors, how do they give a look on ECG, right? So right now the entire heart is at rest, right? So no cardiac dipoles, you get a flat line. Now, once the SA node picks up some activity and spreads some depolarization, you have a cardiac dipole, right? Now this cardiac dipole would be recorded on lead 2. So this is roughly at 60 degrees. So lead 2 is also at 60 degrees. So you get a decent size deflection, right? Like this. Now as depolarization proceeds, right? So larger cardiac dipole, so you get a slightly bigger deflection now. Now depolarization is continuing on, right? So accordingly, depending on the dipole, you get a waveform. Now finally, towards the end of atrial depolarization, right, the dipole is becoming smaller. So the P wave amplitude is also going to decrease now, right? Right? And once the atria is completely depolarized, right? Right? Sorry. Once the atria is completely depolarized, right, there's a fibrous skeleton between the atria and ventricle. So electrical communication cannot take place except through the AV node. So once the atria is completely depolarized, at that point of time, there'll be no cardiac dipoles until further ventricular conduction takes place. So then you're back to a flat line. So whenever there's an active cardiac dipole, we get a corresponding ECG deflection. So P waves are produced by atrial depolarization. Now, the depolarization has proceeded to what we call the AV node. So atrial depolarization was done. We got a P wave because of it. Now conduction continues across the AV node. Now one functional key thing to keep in mind is AV node is a very slow conducting tissue, right? Because it's slow conduction, there's a delay of conduction. We call this an AV nodal delay. That's roughly around 90 to 100 milliseconds. Now this gap is important. So this ensures that atria and ventricles, there's a gap between their excitation, and because there's a gap in their excitation, there'll be a gap in their contraction. So first the atria contract and then the ventricle contract. This ensures the continuous pumping through the atria and into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles into the great vessels of the heart. So AV node and bundle of His tissues are very low in mass. So the cardiac dipoles produced in the AV node and bundle of His wouldn't be recorded on a conventional ECG. you'll need to put electrodes directly near the heart on these specific tissues. You would get something called a bundle of his histogram, right? So now the depolarization spreads from the AV node bundle of his into the branches of the bundle of his, the right and the left bundle branches of the bundle of his. And the first part of the ventricle to get depolarized is the ventricular septum. So the ventricular septum depolarizes from right side to the, sorry, from the left side to the right side. So the cardiac vector points from left to right, right? Because this cardiac vector is pointing away from lead 2. So lead 2 is at 60 degrees, right? Lead 2 would be in 60-degree angle, something like this, whereas these vectors are pointing in the opposite direction. So when depolarization is pointing away from the lead vector, right, we get a negative deflection. So if you'll see, the ECG waveform recorded in lead 2 for septal depolarization of the ventricle is a small negative waveform. We call that a Q wave, right? So this is negative because it's depolarizing from in an opposite direction to lead to. So the ventricle septum is the first part of the ventricle to depolarize, right? Now, just to quickly summarize, P waves because of atrium, PR segment, this flat line between the P wave and QRS complex is because of AV nodal and bundle of his conduction. AV nodal conduction is slow, AV nodal delay. So that's why we have a decent sized PR segment. A ventricular septum, because of the nature of the cardiac vector, is a negative deflection on lead to. We call this a Q wave. Now the next step of depolarization is, we have a bundle of fibers and the Purkinje fiber system. So they will start depolarizing what we call the ventricular apex, right? This is the ventricular apex and the ventricular free wall. Now, if you see the direction of depolarization, so ventricular apex is the first to get depolarized, and depolarization spreads from inside to outside, what we call endocardium to epicardium. So because of this pattern of tissue, the endocardium side of the myocardium is the first to depolarize, and the epicardial side is yet to be depolarized. So now our cardiac vectors point from endocardium to epicardium outwards, inside to outwards. Now, because of this, if you take a vector sum, now if you'll see magnitude of the cardiac vectors are higher on the left ventricle than the right ventricle. This is because the left ventricle is in the systemic circulation, higher pressures, so it's thicker. So more cardiac electrical muscle mass, you get larger vectors. So if you see the balance of activity between right ventricle and left ventricle, this electrical activity is dominant on the left side. So if I take a vector sum of all these cardiac vectors, I would get a cardiac vector pointing towards the left ventricle, towards the cardiac apex. So this is kind of along the same direction of lead 2. Lead 2 is 60 degrees. So you get a big high amplitude positive wave. Now why is this high in amplitude compared to a P wave? Ventricles have more mass. More mass gives rise to a larger cardiac vector. Now, why is this having such a rapid slope compared to the slow rise of the P wave? This is because ventricular conduction is very fast to the Purkinje fiber system. So large amounts of ventricle get excited. So you get these large cardiac vectors. Now, so basically P wave, PR segment, Q wave, the positive part of the QRS complex. Now, eventually, the ventricle free wall depolarizes and till the epicardium also. And at the same time, if you'll see what has happened, atrial repolarization has taken place. But atrial repolarization is a smaller electrical event compared to ventricle. Ventricles have larger mass. So the electrical activity of E wave of the atrial depolarization would be dominated by the electrical events of the ventricle. So we do not really get a representation of atrial repolarization on ECG. Right now, the entire free wall of the ventricles get depolarized. Right, the last part of the cardiac myocardium to depolarize is what we call the base of the hearts. Right, towards the posterior side and the posterior superior side of the ventricles. So your cardiac vectors in the ventricular base would look something like. So let me just bring up the cardiac vectors. Right. 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 Now you have cardiac vectors pointing from the free wall of the ventricle to the cardiac base. So if you see these vectors, they're pointing in the opposite direction of the original vector. of the ventricular free wall. So they're pointing away from lead 2, right? So these lead 2 is 60 degrees in this direction, right? Lead 2 would be 60 degrees like this, these vectors in the opposite direction. So because of this, we get negative deflection in the QRS complex. So negative deflection. Now this negative deflection is representative of depolarization of the ventricular base, the last part of the ventricle to get depolarized. Now eventually, what happens when there's complete ventricular depolarization? So I'll just bring up all the activities from the starting, right? P wave, PR segment, right? Now, small Q wave because of ventricular septum, right? Positive part of the RS because of the ventricular free wall, right? Atria have repolarized, right? Ventricular free wall is completely repolarized. So right now there's almost zero vector in this direction. Now there's a small negative deflection because of the basal deflection of the depolation of the basal. Now we eventually reach a state where the entire ventricle is depolarized. So when the entire ventricle is depolarized, there will be no net current flows, no cardiac dipoles. So current can't flow from the ventricle to the atria because there's a fibrous exoskeleton which prevents that current flow. So the only electrical connectivity between the atrium and ventricle is to the AV node bundle of His. So when there's no net current flow, we get a isoelectric baseline. Now eventually ventricles start repolarizing, right? So the entire ventricle is currently depolarized. Now the ventricles start repolarizing. So if you see the sequence of events, the last part to depolarize was the ventricular base. The first part to repolarize is again the ventricular base. So this is because these cardiac muscle in the ventricular base has a shorter duration action potential, whereas ventricular free wall and septum have a longer duration action potential. So it's repolarizing in the opposite direction in which it depolarized, right? So if you see now, repolarization has taken place, right? The epicardial side has repolarized, whereas the endocardial side is still depolarized. So funnily enough, because of this, the cardiac vectors again points from from endocardium to epicardium. See, cardiac depolarization vector of the ventricle was pointing in this direction. The repolarization vector also points in this direction because the epicardium is repolarizing first. Now, because of this, we get a positive deflection in the T wave. Repolarization is slower, so that's why T wave is not as spiky as the QRS complex. And eventually, the entire ventricle repolarizes, we get a flat line again. Right? So let's just quickly go through the entire sequence once again. So we start from the SA node, right? 1 second. Sorry, we'll go slowly. We start from the SA node. Right? The first event is atrium, right? So you can see I've kind of animated this to match the events, right? So atrial depolarization is P wave, right? Then this AV node, ventricular septum, ventricular free wall, ventricular base, depolarization, like this. So you get different waveforms corresponding with different events of the cardiac cycle. So different electrical events of the cardiac cycle would give rise to the different waveforms of your ECG. So let's just quickly see some of these key ECG waves and intervals and what they correspond to. So initially you have a flat line when the SA node is yet to fire. So once the SA node fires, right, you get the initial wave called a P wave. So P wave is produced by atrial depolarization. Then we get a flat line, PR segment, right? PR segment is because of AV nodal delay and bundle of His conduction. So P wave and PR segment together are also called PR interval. So PR interval is the time taken for conduction from SA node till the ventricular septum, right? So it's a measure of what we call atrioventricular conduction. So if there's some delay in conduction between atria and ventricles, PR interval would be elevated. Now we get a Q wave. So the Q wave is a negative deflection because of ventricular septal depolarization. Then we get the positive part of the QRS complex, right? We call it an R wave. Then there's a negative part of the QRS complex, S wave. So QRS. This is because of ventricular conduction and depolarization of the ventricle in a specific pattern, right? Then the entire ventricle is depolarized, so there's no net current flow. We get a isoelectric line called the ST segment. Hmm? So the ventricle is completely depolarized. Then the ventricle starts repolarizing. We get a T wave, right? Then the entire heart's in diastole. We get a TP segment until the next T wave of the next cycle, right? So now we primarily have focused on the lead 2 system to understand the genesis of the P wave, the QRS complex, and T waves. So I'll quickly step through some of the operational and technical details of the 12 lead ECG system. So 12 lead has 12 leads, as the name says. So three of them are what we call bipolar limb leads, lead 1, lead 2, lead 3. Three of them are augmented versions of unipolar limb leads, AVL, AVF, AVR. Then we have 6 chest leads or precordial leads based on the precordium of the chest. They numbered from V1 to V6. So a little bit about the details. So if you see the lead vector, right, for lead 1, negative, positive. So the lead vector is pointing from right arm to left arm, right? Lead 2, the lead vector points from right arm to left to the foot, and for the lead 3, it points from left arm to foot, right? Augmented unipolar leads, basically what we are measuring, for example, in AVF, is potential difference between the foot and the average of the other two limb leads. So the lead vector points from the center to the foot. Lead vector in AVL points from center to the left arm. Lead vector in AVR points from the center to the right arm, right? So if you see the lead vector system, right, in the frontal plane or coronal plane, so lead 1 is 0 degrees, lead 2 60, lead 3 120, AVF 90, AVL minus 30, and AVR minus 150. So why do we have so many leads? The idea is if the cardiac activity is, you know, pointed in this direction, right? Lead 2 would be positive. Now, if the cardiac activity for some reason is in this direction, right? It's perpendicular to lead 2. You wouldn't get a very good recording on lead 2. So for that, maybe you need AVL. So the idea of having multiple leads is we are able to pick up any cardiac vector in any direction will eventually have a very good graphical recording on your ECG. So these are your frontal plane or coronal plane ECG lead vectors. Now, along with the coronal plane, we have chest electrodes. These are placed at different points on the chest, right? If you are doing this practically, they are placed. So some parts V1, V2 correspond to the right ventricle, V2 the septum between the ventricles, V3, V4 the anterior part, V5, V6 the lateral part of the left ventricle. So if you see the lead vectors, we have 6 frontal plane vectors and 6 transverse plane vectors. So we can think of this as cameras covering the action. So depending on which direction the action is taking place, you have one lead vector, which is basically a camera, best suited to study that action. Right now, finally, a little bit about ECG systematic interpretation. So we calculate the rate, we see a rhythm, right? We see the axis, we see the morphology and durations, P wave and PR interval. PR interval gives you information about atrioventricular conduction. QRS duration gives you information of the ventricular conduction, right? ST segment and T wave will give you information about the repolarization associated electrical events. And finally, you do an overall interpretation based on your findings in these 6 things. So if you see a 12 lead ECG like this, you see, depending on the lead vector, some leads are positive, some leads will be negative. So AVR is usually negative because it points in the opposite direction. So, thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay, for a very comprehensive, visually lucid presentation of ECG. All of us have had some doubts about ECG, so you made everything very clear and very lucid. Thank you once again. I would like to request the audience for their probable questions. We are open for question and answer session now. First of all, we would be taking questions for Dr. Chitturi for ECG. I think because of the lucid presentation, we as of now do not have any more questions.
Thank you. So when there are no questions, I either assume my audience has understood everything or they've understood nothing. I'm an optimist. I hope it's option one.
So we are also open for questions because if many of the students are there who will be probably watching at a later point of time, so even if you have some questions, you can post it online. We will on the YouTube channel. We will get back to that, and from that we move on to our next part. If we have any questions on cardiac cycle, you are also welcome. The audience can post it on the YouTube channel and we will get back to that. With this, we come to the end of the session, and I would like to request Dr. Shampa Sarkar Bishas, Assistant Professor, Department of Life Sciences, Presidency University, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks. Dr. Bishas, I think again there is no, she is present.
I
Thank
think
you, ma'am.
I'm in. Yeah. So, good evening, all of you. I hope you all had a very wonderful session with the cardiac cycle as well as ECG. And on behalf of PSI Education Committee, I first of all like to thank Professor Amut Chandro, who is an honorary president of Physiological Society of India, for immensely supporting us and constantly triggering us for this wonderful platform, and that uh, he supports us for airing this kind of lecture series. And again, I would like to thank all the office bearers of Physiological Society of India for supporting this Physiological Society Education Committee, who has taken the responsibilities of broadcasting these kind of uh, lecture series, which are essential for both the UG as well as the PG students who cater to human physiology. Now, next, I would like to thank Professor Asim Basak, Professor, Department of Allied Sciences, Brainware University, for his detailed presentation on cardiac cycle, and Dr. Vinay Chitturi for his animated version of ECG. And I hope Dr. Chitturi has made understanding of Chitturi in a very lucid way, and so that all the hyperpolarization, depolarization has been explained in such a beautiful and such an easy manner. It's very difficult for teacher to teach the effects or the electrical events of ECG, or the cardiac or the heart, electrical events of the heart, to present in such a lucid manner. So, thanks a lot to Dr. Chaturi for his lucid presentation. And not the least, I would thank all the members of the PSI Education Committee for their constructive thinking for this presentation of lecture series. And I think we are able to continue these lecture series on and on. And over to Thakshani to wind up the rest of the program.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I again would like to thank our honorable speakers for their wonderful presentations. With this, we come to the end of this session. And on behalf of the Education Committee of the Physiological Society of India, I would like to announce that the third installment of this online webinar series will be held on 23rd of September 2023 from 7 p.m. onwards. The honorable speakers on that day will be Dr. Amit Bandyopadhyay, Assistant Professor, Department of Physiology, University of Calcutta, and Dr. Ishita Shaha, Assistant Professor, Department of Physiology, Medical College, Kolkata, who will be honoring us with their lectures on various topics. And for that, we will be waiting, and I hope the audience will be waiting too. With that, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day, good night, and take care.